After I lost my $20 million company due to false fraud accusations, I was forced to work as a janitor in a courthouse. That's when my wife left me. One day, a billionaire woman was abandoned by her lawyer, and I decided to defend her myself. We won the case, and what she did for me changed everything. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I used to believe that hard work and integrity were enough to protect you from the world's cruelties. I was wrong. My name is Albert, and at 56 years old, I learned that sometimes the people who destroy you are the ones who know you best. The ones who sit at your dinner table, who know your weaknesses, who you trust with your life. It was a Tuesday morning in March when everything fell apart. I was sitting in my corner office on the 32nd floor, reviewing quarterly reports for Morrison Industries, the construction company I had built from nothing over 23 years. $20 million in annual revenue, 350 employees, projects spanning 6 states. I had every reason to feel proud. The knock on my door came at exactly 9:45. I remember the time because I was scheduled for a 10 o'clock meeting with our biggest client. Instead, 2 FBI agents walked in, followed by my own attorney, Marcus Williams, whose face was as white as the papers he carried. "Albert Morrison?" the taller agent asked, though he clearly knew who I was. "That's me," I replied, setting down my coffee cup with hands that were already beginning to shake. "You're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and money laundering." The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd that my brain couldn't process it any other way. "There's been a mistake," I said, standing up. "I've never stolen a penny in my life." But there hadn't been a mistake. As they read me my rights, Marcus finally found his voice. "Albert, someone's been moving money through shell companies, large amounts. The paper trail leads directly to you." The next few hours were a blur of handcuffs, booking photos, and a holding cell that smelled like disinfectant and despair. My brother David posted bail that evening, his face grim as we drove home in silence. "Who would do this?" I asked him as we pulled into my driveway. David's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "I don't know, Albert. But whoever it is, they knew exactly what they were doing." The investigation moved quickly, too quickly. Within 2 weeks, they had frozen all my assets, seized my company, and painted me as a criminal mastermind who had been stealing from his own employees' pension fund. The media picked up the story, and suddenly Albert Morrison wasn't a respected businessman. I was a con man who had fooled everyone for decades. Vanessa, my wife of 15 years, stood by me at first. She held my hand during the initial court hearings, told reporters that she believed in my innocence. But as the evidence mounted, forged documents, fake email trails, bank records I had never seen before, I watched the doubt creep into her eyes. "They have your signature on everything," she said one evening as we sat in our living room, surrounded by legal documents. "Your passwords, your authorization codes. How is that possible if you didn't do it?" "I don't know," I admitted. And those 3 words felt like admitting defeat. "But I swear to you, Vanessa, I never stole anything." She wanted to believe me. I could see it in the way she searched my face, looking for some sign that would make everything make sense. But doubt, once it takes root, grows like a cancer. The worst part wasn't losing the money or even facing prison time. The worst part was watching my reputation crumble, seeing 23 years of honest work reduced to nothing by accusations I couldn't disprove. Former friends crossed the street to avoid me. Business partners who had shaken my hand for decades suddenly couldn't return my calls. My lawyer, Marcus, worked tirelessly to find holes in the prosecution's case, but for every lead we followed, we hit another dead end. It was as if someone had spent months, maybe years, carefully constructing this web of lies, making sure every loose thread was tied up. "Whoever did this," Marcus told me during one particularly difficult meeting, "they didn't just want to steal from you, they wanted to destroy you completely." The company I had built was sold at auction to pay back the supposedly stolen funds. My house went into foreclosure, my savings, my retirement, my children's college funds, all gone. At 56 years old, I was left with nothing but a criminal record I didn't deserve and a reputation that would follow me for the rest of my life. The job at the courthouse came through a friend of a friend, someone who knew I needed work and didn't care about the scandal. Janitor at the Hamilton County Courthouse, $12 an hour, night shift. It wasn't just a job, it was a reminder of how far I had fallen. My first night, I stood in the marble lobby with my mop bucket, looking up at the scales of justice carved into the wall above the main entrance. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, cleaning the floors of a building dedicated to justice, when justice had failed me completely. But something strange happened during those quiet midnight hours. As I mopped floors and emptied trash cans, I started listening to the cases being tried during the day. I read the documents that lawyers left behind, studied the legal briefs that ended up in wastebaskets. Slowly, I began to understand how the system worked, and more importantly, how it could be manipulated. The revelation came to me gradually, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. Someone with intimate knowledge of my business, my passwords, my personal habits had orchestrated this destruction. Someone who knew me well enough to forge my signatures convincingly, to predict my reactions, to stay 2 steps ahead of every move I made. Someone in my own family. The thought made me physically sick, but the more I considered it, the more it made sense. David had access to my office, knew my routines, had been present for every major business decision over the past 5 years. He had encouraged me to trust certain people, to make certain investments that now seemed designed to create vulnerabilities in my company's finances. And then there was his wife, Sarah, Vanessa's sister, who had always resented what she called my success story, who had made cutting remarks about how easy I had it, how some people got all the luck while others had to struggle. As I pushed my mop cart through the empty courthouse hallways, pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. But knowing and proving were 2 different things entirely. 3 months into my job as a courthouse janitor, I thought I had reached the bottom. I was wrong. Rock bottom, as it turned out, had a basement. The divorce papers arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by a courier who looked embarrassed to be handing them to a man in a janitor's uniform. Vanessa hadn't even had the courtesy to tell me herself. I learned I was being divorced the same way I learned about most things in my life now, through official documents that treated me like a stranger. I sat in the courthouse break room during my lunch hour, reading through the papers with hands that shook more from anger than shock. Vanessa was demanding spousal support, claiming that she had given up her career to support mine and deserved compensation for the lifestyle she had become accustomed to. The irony was suffocating. She wanted money from a man who emptied trash cans for $12 an hour. But what really broke something inside me was the final page. She was asking for a restraining order, claiming that my erratic behavior and financial crimes made me a potential danger. In 15 years of marriage, I had never raised my voice to her, let alone my hand. Yet here she was, painting me as some kind of threat to justify keeping me away from the life we had built together. Rough day? I looked up to see Margaret Chen, one of the court clerks, standing in the doorway with a cup of coffee. She was probably in her early 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of practical demeanor that came from years of watching human drama unfold in courtrooms. "My wife is divorcing me," I said, because at this point, what was the use in pretending everything was fine? Margaret sat down across from me without being invited. "The construction company guy, right? I remember your case." I nodded, waiting for the judgment. The careful distance that most people maintained around me now. "Instead," she said, "for what it's worth, I've seen a lot of financial crime cases come through here. Yours didn't smell right." Smell right? Real embezzlers, they usually leave messy trails because they're trying to hide money quickly. Your case was too clean, too perfect, like someone had all the time in the world to set it up. It was the first time in months that someone had expressed doubt about my guilt, and I felt my throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Doesn't matter now," I managed. "Damage is done." Margaret studied me for a moment. "You know, working nights here, You probably overhear a lot of things, see a lot of legal strategies. Some people might learn something from that. She was right. Over the past 3 months, I had become an accidental expert in legal procedure. I knew which lawyers were competent and which ones were just expensive. I understood how evidence was presented, how witnesses were questioned, how cases were won and lost on technicalities that had nothing to do with the truth. Learning doesn't change anything, I said. Maybe not, Margaret replied, standing up. But knowledge is power, Albert. Even when everything else is taken from you, they can't take what you know. She left me sitting there with her words echoing in my head and divorce papers scattered across the table like the fragments of my former life. That evening, as I cleaned the family court offices, I couldn't stop thinking about Vanessa's allegations, erratic behavior, financial crimes. The words were carefully chosen, designed to create a narrative that would justify anything she wanted to do. I was emptying the wastebasket in Judge Harrison's chambers when I found the document that changed everything. It was crumpled at the bottom, clearly thrown away by mistake, but the letterhead made my blood run cold. Williams, Patterson, and Associates. Marcus Williams's law firm. My own attorney's firm. The document was a consultation fee invoice dated 2 weeks before the FBI had shown up at my office. The client name made my hands shake. Sarah Morrison. David's wife. My sister-in-law. I sat down heavily in the judge's chair, staring at the paper. Sarah had been consulting with my own lawyer before I was even arrested. The woman who had sat at my dinner table, who had smiled at me during family gatherings, who had access to every detail of my personal and professional life through her husband. The pieces weren't just falling into place anymore, they were crashing down like an avalanche. David and Sarah hadn't just stolen my company, they had used my own attorney to do it. Marcus, the man I had trusted to defend me, had been working against me from the beginning. My phone buzzed with a text message. Vanessa. Need to talk. Can you meet me at Riverside Cafe tomorrow at 6? I stared at the message for a long time before responding. I'll be there. The next evening I arrived at Riverside Cafe 20 minutes early, partly out of habit and partly because I wanted to see her walk in. I needed to watch her face to look for signs of the woman I had loved for 15 years. She was 10 minutes late, which was unusual for Vanessa. She had always been punctual to a fault. When she finally appeared in the doorway, I barely recognized her. She had lost weight, her hair was different, and she was wearing clothes I had never seen before. Expensive clothes. Albert, she said, sliding into the booth across from me. No hello, no how are you? Just my name, spoken like an obligation. You look good, I said, because she did and because I didn't know how else to start a conversation with the woman who was divorcing me. Thank you. She folded her hands on the table, and I noticed her wedding ring was gone. I wanted to talk to you about the settlement. Settlement? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Vanessa, I empty trash cans for a living. What exactly are you planning to settle for? Her jaw tightened. You had assets, investments, things that were hidden before the trial. Hidden. The word came out louder than I intended, causing other diners to look in our direction. Everything I had was seized by the FBI. You know that. I know what you told me, she said quietly. But Albert, I also know you're not stupid. Men like you always have backup plans. Men like you. As if I were a species she was studying rather than a man she had shared a bed with for 15 years. What happened to us, I asked. When did you stop believing in me? For just a moment her composed mask slipped, and I saw something that looked like pain in her eyes. When the evidence became impossible to ignore. When staying married to you became impossible to justify. To who? She blinked. What? Impossible to justify to who, Vanessa? Who are you worried about disappointing? She looked away, and in that gesture I saw the truth. This wasn't just about the money or the scandal. Someone had convinced her to leave me. Someone had been whispering in her ear, telling her that staying with me was foolish, that she deserved better. It doesn't matter, she said finally. What matters is moving forward. Are you seeing someone? The question hung in the air between us like a landmine. Vanessa's face flushed, and she started gathering her purse. That's not relevant to our conversation. But it was relevant. It was the missing piece I hadn't even known I was looking for. Vanessa wasn't just leaving me because of the scandal. She was leaving me for someone else. Someone who had been there to comfort her during the worst period of my life. Someone who had told her exactly what she wanted to hear about her faithless, criminal husband. As she stood to leave, I grabbed her wrist gently. "Just tell me one thing. When did it start?" She looked down at my hand on her wrist, and for a second I thought she might pull away. Instead, she met my eyes. 6 months ago, she whispered. 6 months ago. 3 months before my arrest. 3 months before my... World collapsed. She had been planning her exit before I even knew I was in danger. After she left, I sat in that cafe booth for 2 hours, watching the sun set through the window and feeling something cold and hard settle in my chest. It wasn't anger exactly, and it wasn't grief, it was clarity. I had been so focused on proving my innocence that I had missed the bigger picture. This wasn't just about destroying my business, it was about destroying my entire life. My marriage, my reputation, my future. Someone had orchestrated all of it with surgical precision, but they had made one mistake. They had underestimated what I would become in the darkness they had created for me. Working the night shift at the courthouse had given me an education I never expected, not just in legal procedures and court protocols, but in reading people. You learn a lot about human nature when you're invisible, when people talk around you as if you don't exist. So when Helena Blackwood walked into courtroom 7 on a Tuesday morning in October, I knew immediately that she was different from the usual parade of defendants who passed through these halls. I was cleaning the gallery when she entered, flanked by 2 attorneys who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Helena Blackwood was 62 years old, according to the case file I'd glimpsed, but she carried herself with the kind of confidence that made age irrelevant. Her silver hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon. Her navy suit was clearly custom-made, and her posture suggested she was accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room. What struck me most, though, was her eyes. They held the same expression I'd seen in my own mirror for months, the look of someone who had been betrayed by people they trusted. The case against Helena Blackwood had been making headlines for weeks. She was accused of manipulating real estate markets, using insider information to drive up property values in specific neighborhoods before selling at massive profits. The prosecution claimed she had bilked investors out of nearly $15 million over a 3-year period. But as I listened to the proceedings from my position near the back of the courtroom, something felt wrong. The evidence was too neat, too convenient. It reminded me of my own case, a perfect paper trail that told a story, but not necessarily the truth. Helena's lead attorney, Jonathan Reeves, was one of the most expensive lawyers in the state. I'd seen him in action before, and he was usually sharp, aggressive, confident. Today he seemed distracted, almost disinterested. He barely objected to the prosecution's evidence, asked softball questions during cross-examination, and appeared to be going through the motions. During the lunch recess, I was cleaning the defendant's consultation room when I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. "The partnership agreement is very clear, Mrs. Blackwood," Reeves was saying, his voice carrying the tone of a man delivering bad news. "If you're convicted, your shares in Blackwood Properties automatically transfer to the other partners." "That's convenient," Helena replied, her voice dry as dust, "especially since those partners are the ones who provided most of the evidence against me. I'm simply advising you of the legal realities." "No, Jonathan, you're advising me to accept defeat. There's a difference." I paused in my cleaning, pretending to organize supplies while listening intently. "Helena, be realistic. The evidence is overwhelming. The best we can hope for is a plea bargain that keeps you out of federal prison. The evidence is fabricated. That's not for us to determine. That's for the jury to decide. Based on the defense you present, which so far has been pathetic." There was a long silence, then Reeves spoke again, his voice colder now. "Perhaps you should consider finding new representation if you're dissatisfied with my performance." "Perhaps I should?" I heard chairs scraping against the floor, footsteps, and then the door opened. Reeves walked out first, already pulling out his cell phone. A few minutes later, Helena emerged, looking like a woman who had just realized she was completely alone. That evening, I was cleaning the courthouse library when Helena appeared in the doorway. She looked exhausted, her perfect composure finally cracking around the edges. "Excuse me," she said, and I turned around, surprised to be directly addressed by anyone involved in the proceedings. "Yes, ma'am?" "You're here every night, aren't you? Cleaning, listening?" I nodded, uncertain where this was going. "What's your name?" Albert Morrison." Her eyes widened slightly. "Morrison Industries. I remember reading about your case." Heat flushed my cheeks. Even here, even now, my past followed me like a shadow. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. It's just that I remember thinking at the time that something about your case seemed off." "Off how?" Helena looked around the empty library, then stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "I've been in business for 40 years, she said. "I've seen real financial crime, real embezzlement. Your case was too clean, too perfect. Real criminals make mistakes, leave loose ends. Your case read like someone had spent months making sure every detail was airtight." It was almost exactly what Margaret Chen had said months earlier, but hearing it from someone who understood business the way Helena did carried more weight. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Because I think we might have the same problem." "Meaning?" "Meaning I think someone is trying to destroy me using the same playbook they used on you." I set down my cleaning supplies and gave her my full attention. "My business partners," she continued, "Stephen Mills and Richard Torres, have been pushing me to retire for the past 2 years. Said I was getting too old, making bad decisions, holding the company back. When I refused, strange things started happening. Contracts went missing, deals fell through at the last minute, financial records were altered." "Did you confront them?" "Of course, they acted shocked, concerned, suggested I might be having memory issues. Stephen even recommended I see a neurologist." Her laugh was bitter. 40 years of building a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and suddenly I'm too senile to remember my own business decisions. But you remembered everything. Every detail, every conversation, every decision, every document, which is how I know the evidence in this case is fake." I found myself leaning forward, drawn into her story despite myself. 3 months ago, Stephen came to me with what he called a generous buyout offer. $50 million for my 70% stake in the company. When I told him it was worth closer to $200 million, he said I was being unrealistic about the company's value. And then you were arrested. 2 weeks later, funny how that works. We stood there in silence for a moment. Two people who had been systematically destroyed by people they trusted. "Jonathan Reeves," I said finally. "How long has he been your attorney?" "Stephen recommended him 6 months ago. Said I needed someone who specialized in financial crime defense." Helena's eyes sharpened. "Why do you ask?" I thought about the invoice I'd found in Judge Harrison's wastebasket, about my own attorney's betrayal. What if I told you that your lawyer might be working against you? Helena's face went very still. "I'd ask you to explain." I told her about Marcus Williams, about finding the consultation invoice with Sarah's name on it, about how my own defense had been sabotaged from the inside. "It's the perfect crime," I concluded. "They don't just steal from you, they make you complicit in your own destruction. They use your own lawyer to make sure you can't fight back effectively." Helena was quiet for a long time, processing what I'd told her. "If you're right," she said finally, "then I'm going to be convicted. My shares will transfer to Stephen and Richard, and they'll have successfully stolen a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Unless we do something about it." The words came out before I could stop them. Helena raised an eyebrow. "We." I thought about the months I'd spent learning legal procedure, studying case law, watching competent attorneys work. I thought about the nights I'd spent reading through legal briefs, understanding how evidence was presented, how arguments were constructed. "I can't practice law," I said slowly, but I can assist. I can research, investigate, help you prepare your own defense. Albert, I appreciate the offer, but you're not a lawyer. Neither were most of the founding fathers when they wrote the Constitution, I replied. Sometimes being an outsider is an advantage. Sometimes you need someone who thinks differently. Helena studied my face for a long moment. What would you want in return? The question surprised me. I hadn't thought about compensation, hadn't considered what I might gain from helping her. I want to prove that we're not criminals, I said finally. I want to show that good people can fight back when the system fails them. Helena extended her hand. Then let's get to work. As we shook hands in that quiet library, surrounded by law books and the ghosts of justice denied, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. But hope, as I was about to learn, was a dangerous thing when you were up against people who had already destroyed you once. Helena fired Jonathan Reeves the next morning. The courtroom was buzzing with whispers when she stood up during the pre-trial hearing and announced that she would be representing herself with assistance from a legal consultant. Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation despite the shared name, looked skeptical. Mrs. Blackwood, I strongly advise against self-representation in a case of this magnitude. I understand the risks, Your Honor, but I no longer have confidence in Mr. Reeves's ability to represent my interests. Reeves looked genuinely shocked, which told me he hadn't expected Helena to discover his betrayal so quickly. The prosecution, led by District Attorney James Fletcher, seemed pleased by this development. They probably thought Helena was making their job easier. They had no idea what was coming. That night, Helena and I met in the courthouse library to begin our real investigation. I had convinced Margaret Chen to give us access to the building after hours, ostensibly so I could complete my cleaning duties. What we were really doing was conducting the defense that should have been mounted from the beginning. Tell me about the missing contracts, I said, spreading Helena's business records across one of the library tables. 3 major deals, all within the past 18 months, Helena replied, pulling out copies of documents from her briefcase. The Patterson Development Project, the Riverside Shopping Center, and the Harbor View condominiums. In each case, contracts that should have been filed with the City Planning Office mysteriously disappeared. I studied the paperwork, looking for patterns. What made these projects special? They were all in neighborhoods that suddenly became very desirable after we started development. Property values shot up 30 to 40% within months of our announcements. Which is what the prosecution says proves you were manipulating the market. Exactly. But here's what they're not telling the jury. In each case, Stephen and Richard had inside information about planned city improvements that would naturally drive up property values. I looked up from the documents. What kind of improvements? New subway lines, highway, expansions, public parks, all projects that were in the planning stages when we bought the properties, but not yet public knowledge. How did Stephen and Richard know about them? Helena's expression darkened. Richard's brother-in-law sits on the City Planning Commission. Stephen's college roommate works for the State Transportation Department. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but it wasn't the one the prosecution was painting. So they knew these areas would become valuable, convinced you to invest, then made it look like you were the one with illegal inside information. While they positioned themselves to take over the company when I was convicted. I leaned back in my chair, thinking. We need to prove they had access to this information before you did, and we need to show that Jonathan Reeves was deliberately sabotaging your defense. How do we do that? I thought about my own case, about the invoice I'd found with Sarah's name on it. We follow the money. Legal bills, consulting fees, communication records. If Reeves was working with the prosecution or with Stephen and Richard, there'll be a paper trail. We worked until 3 in the morning, going through Helena's business records with the methodical attention of archaeologists uncovering ancient secrets. What we found was disturbing but not surprising. A pattern of decisions that made sense only if you assumed Helena's partners were working against her. The next day, while Helena prepared for court, I visited the county clerk's office during my lunch break. Working at the courthouse had its advantages. I knew which clerks were helpful and which ones would look the other way if you needed to access public records that weren't technically public yet. "Albert," Margaret Chen greeted me as I approached her desk, "what brings you to the land of the living during daylight hours?" "I need a favor, Margaret. A big one." She glanced around the office, then leaned closer. "What kind of favor?" "I need to see the billing records for Williams, Patterson and Associates, specifically any payments from Blackwood Properties or its partners over the past year." Margaret's eyebrows shot up. "That's not exactly public information." "But it becomes public if it's relevant to an ongoing criminal case, right?" She studied my face for a moment. "You're not just cleaning floors anymore, are you?" "I'm trying to prevent an innocent woman from going to prison." Margaret was quiet for a long time. Then she stood up. "Take a walk with me." We left the clerk's office and walked through the courthouse corridors, past the courtrooms where justice was supposedly served every day. "The Blackwood case has been bothering me," Margaret said finally. "Too clean, just like yours. And Jonathan Reeves has been acting strange lately." "Strange how?" "He's been asking unusual questions about sentencing guidelines, about asset forfeiture procedures, questions that suggest he expects his client to be convicted." We stopped walking, and Margaret turned to face me. "What you're asking me to do could cost me my job." "I know, and I wouldn't ask if there was any other way." She sighed. "Give me 2 hours." At 4:30 that afternoon, Margaret handed me a manila envelope as I passed her desk. "I don't know what's in there," she said loudly enough for nearby clerks to hear. "And you found it in the trash." The envelope contained photocopies of financial records that made my hands shake. Over the past year, Williams, Patterson and Associates had received 3 separate payments from Stephen Mills's personal account, totaling $75,000. The payments were listed as consultation fees and legal research, but they corresponded exactly with key dates in Helena's case. More damning still was a payment from Richard Torres to a private investigation firm, the same firm that had discovered the evidence of Helena's supposed market manipulation. But the most shocking discovery was in the final pages of the documents. Jonathan Reeves had received a $200,000 success fee payment from a shell company called Meridian Holdings. According to the incorporation documents attached to the payment record, Meridian Holdings was owned by Stephen Mills and Richard Torres. They had paid Helena's own lawyer to ensure her conviction. That evening, Helena and I met again in the courthouse library. When I showed her the financial records, her face went completely white. "They bought my lawyer," she whispered. "Just like they bought mine," I replied, thinking of Marcus Williams and the consultation fee from Sarah. Helena set the papers down with shaking hands. "Albert, this is bigger than just our 2 cases. If they're willing to corrupt attorneys, to fabricate evidence, to destroy innocent people, how many others have they done this to?" The question hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. We had stumbled onto something much larger than 2 isolated cases of fraud. We had discovered a system, a method, a way of stealing everything from people while making them complicit in their own destruction. "We need to present this evidence," Helena said. "Not yet. They'll claim the documents were obtained illegally, that we're fabricating evidence to save ourselves. We need more." "What kind of more?" I thought about Vanessa's confession at the cafe, about her admission that she had been seeing someone for 6 months, about the careful timing of everything that had happened to me. "We need to connect your case to mine. If we can show this is a pattern, a conspiracy, then the evidence becomes harder to dismiss." Helena leaned forward. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we need to find out who else has been destroyed by this system, and I'm thinking we need to figure out what Stephen and Richard have in common with my brother David and his wife Sarah." As if summoned by my words, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from a number I didn't recognize, but the message made my blood run cold. "Stop digging or you'll end up worse than broke. You'll end up dead." Helena saw my expression change. "What is it?" I showed her the text. She read it twice, then looked up at me with determination in her eyes. "They're scared," she said. Good. Scared people make mistakes. But as we gathered our papers and prepared to leave the library, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something much more dangerous than a courtroom battle. We weren't just fighting for our innocence anymore, we were fighting for our lives. The war for the truth was about to begin, and the casualties were already mounting. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. 3 days after receiving the threatening text message, I was cleaning the district attorney's office when I overheard a phone conversation that changed everything. James Fletcher, the prosecutor handling Helena's case, was working late, his office door slightly ajar as he spoke in hushed tones to someone on the phone. The Morrison case was perfect, he was saying. Clean conviction, full asset recovery, no appeals. We should be able to replicate that success with Blackwood. I froze, my mop halfway across the floor. He was talking about my case as if it were a template, a model to be copied. Yes, the same legal team, Fletcher continued. Williams handled the defense beautifully, just enough effort to look legitimate, but not enough to actually threaten the conviction. My grip tightened on the mop handle. Marcus Williams hadn't just betrayed me. He had been part of a larger system designed to ensure innocent people were convicted. The fees have been transferred as agreed, Fletcher said. $200,000 to the offshore account, just like the Morrison case. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding. Fletcher wasn't just prosecuting Helena, he was being paid to ensure her conviction. The entire legal system, at least in these cases, was corrupted from top to bottom. That night I called Helena from a payphone outside the courthouse. I didn't trust my cell phone anymore, not after the threatening text. "We need to meet," I said when she answered. "I have information that changes everything." We met at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town, far from the courthouse and anyone who might recognize us. Helena looked exhausted, the strain of representing herself while maintaining her business showing in the dark circles under her eyes. "What did you find?" she asked as soon as I sat down. I told her about Fletcher's phone conversation, about the offshore payments, about how my case had been used as a template for hers. "They're not just stealing our businesses," I concluded. "They're being paid to prosecute us. This is a for-profit conviction system." Helena sat back in the vinyl booth, her face pale. "Who's paying them?" "That's what we need to find out. But I have a theory." I pulled out a notebook where I'd been tracking connections between our cases. In my case, my brother David and his wife Sarah had access to my business information. They recommended Marcus Williams as my attorney. They knew my passwords, my routines, everything. And in my case, Stephen and Richard recommended Jonathan Reeves. They had access to all my business dealings. Right. But here's what's been bothering me. How did they know this system existed? How did they know they could pay lawyers and prosecutors to guarantee convictions? Helena frowned. "You think they're connected somehow? David and Sarah with Stephen and Richard?" "I think they're all part of something bigger, a network that specializes in destroying successful people and stealing their assets." I opened my notebook to a page covered with names, dates, and connections I'd been mapping. "Look at this," I said, pointing to the timeline I'd created. "Your case started 18 months after mine ended. My brother David suddenly had enough money to buy a new house, take expensive vacations. Where did that money come from? From stealing your company? Maybe. Or maybe from getting paid to help steal your company too." Helena studied the notebook, her business mind working through the implications. "You're suggesting that David and Sarah were hired to help Stephen and Richard destroy me?" "I'm suggesting that there's an organization that connects corrupt lawyers, prosecutors, and business partners to systematically destroy people and steal their assets, and I think I know how to prove it." I told Helena about Sarah's consultation with Marcus Williams before my arrest, about the timing that suggested she had known what was coming. "If we can find similar connections between your case and mine, financial transactions, communication records, shared contacts, we can prove this is a conspiracy." Helena was quiet for a long time, then she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "I've been thinking about something," she said. Right after you were arrested, Stephen mentioned that he had heard about a similar case in the construction industry, said it was a cautionary tale about the importance of proper financial controls. He knew about my case? He acted like he'd read about it in the news, but now that I think about it, he knew details that were never made public. He knew about your passwords being compromised, about the shell companies, information that was only available to people directly involved in the case. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Our cases weren't just similar, they were connected. David and Sarah had worked with Stephen and Richard to destroy both of us, probably splitting the profits from our stolen assets. We need to get this information to someone who can act on it, Helena said. Who? Fletcher is corrupt, our lawyers are corrupt, who can we trust? Helena was quiet for a moment. Then her eyes lit up. Judge Morrison. She's been presiding over my case, and she's known for her integrity. If we can present this evidence properly in a way that forces her to act, she'll have to investigate. The corruption would be too obvious to ignore. We spent the next hour planning our strategy. Helena would file a motion to dismiss the charges based on prosecutorial misconduct. During the hearing, we would present the evidence of corruption, the connections between our cases, and the financial records showing payments to lawyers and prosecutors. It was risky. If we were wrong, if we couldn't prove our allegations, Helena would certainly be convicted, and I would probably be charged with obstruction of justice. But if we were right, we could expose a conspiracy that had destroyed dozens of innocent people. The hearing was scheduled for the following Friday. Helena filed her motion on Wednesday, causing a firestorm of activity in the prosecutor's office. Fletcher tried to have the motion dismissed without a hearing, claiming it was frivolous and designed to delay the trial. Judge Morrison, however, was intrigued enough by Helena's allegations to schedule an immediate hearing. Thursday night, as I was finishing my cleaning rounds, I found another threatening message. This one slipped under my apartment door. Last warning, drop this or face the consequences. But it was too late for warnings. We had gone too far to turn back now. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood as I sat in the gallery of Courtroom 7, watching Helena prepare for what might be the most important legal argument of both our lives. She had spent the previous night organizing evidence, preparing her presentation, transforming herself from defendant to prosecutor. Fletcher sat at the prosecution table, flanked by two assistants, his confidence seemingly unshaken by Helena's allegations. But I noticed he kept checking his phone, as if waiting for instructions from someone. Your Honor, Helena began when Judge Morrison called the hearing to order, I am here today to expose a conspiracy that goes to the very heart of our legal system. The charges against me are not the result of a legitimate investigation. They are the product of a for-profit conviction scheme that has been operating in this jurisdiction for at least 2 years. Fletcher jumped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. These are serious allegations being made without any foundation. I have evidence, Your Honor, Helena replied calmly. Financial records, communication logs, and testimony from another victim of this same conspiracy. Judge Morrison looked intrigued. Present your evidence, Mrs. Blackwood. What followed was the most methodical destruction of a corrupt system I had ever witnessed. Helena presented the financial records showing payments from Stephen and Richard to Jonathan Reeves. She showed the offshore payments to Fletcher's office. She demonstrated the connections between my case and hers, the identical methods used to fabricate evidence and corrupt the defense. And then she called me to testify. As I walked to the witness stand, I felt the weight of everyone's eyes on me. The janitor who dared to challenge the system, the convicted felon who claimed innocence, but I wasn't those things anymore. I was a man who had discovered the truth, and I was going to make sure it was heard. Mr. Morrison, Helena said after I was sworn in, please tell the court about your experience with attorney Marcus Williams. I told them everything. About the consultation fee paid by Sarah before my arrest. About Williams's deliberate sabotage of my defense. About the connections between my case and Helena's that proved we were both victims of the same conspiracy. Fletcher tried to discredit my testimony, but the financial records spoke for themselves. When Helena presented the bank statements showing identical payment patterns in both cases, the courtroom fell silent. Judge Morrison studied the evidence for a long time before speaking. "Mr. Fletcher, these allegations are extremely serious. Do you have an explanation for the financial connections between your office and the defendant's business partners?" Fletcher's confidence finally cracked. "Your Honor, these allegations are completely unfounded." "The bank records suggest otherwise," Judge Morrison replied coldly. "Mrs. Blackwood, I am granting your motion to dismiss. Furthermore, I am ordering a full investigation into the prosecutorial misconduct alleged in your filing." The courtroom erupted. Fletcher's face went white as he realized his career was over. Stephen Mills and Richard Torres, who had been sitting in the gallery expecting to watch Helena's conviction, rushed toward the exit. But they didn't make it. FBI agents, alerted by Judge Morrison's preliminary review of our evidence, were waiting in the hallway. As I watched them being led away in handcuffs, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year: vindication. Not just for Helena and me, but for every innocent person who had been destroyed by this system. The truth had finally won. 6 months after Helena's charges were dismissed, I stood in the penthouse office of Blackwood Industries, looking out over the city where I had once lost everything. The view was spectacular, but what made it truly beautiful was knowing that I had earned my place here through truth, not theft. The FBI investigation that followed Judge Morrison's order had unraveled a conspiracy that reached far beyond our 2 cases. David and Sarah, Stephen Mills and Richard Torres, Marcus Williams and Jonathan Reeves, District Attorney James Fletcher. They were all part of a network that had been operating for nearly 5 years, systematically destroying successful business owners and splitting the profits from their stolen assets. 23 cases were overturned. 23 innocent people had their convictions vacated, their reputations restored, their lives given back to them. The monetary damages exceeded $100 million, but the human cost was incalculable. David and Sarah were sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for racketeering and conspiracy. During the trial, the details of their betrayal became public. They had been recruited into the conspiracy through Stephen Mills, who had been looking for someone with access to a successful construction company. David's gambling debts and Sarah's resentment of my success made them perfect targets for recruitment. They had received $2 million for their role in destroying Morrison Industries, $2 million for betraying their own family. Marcus Williams was disbarred and sentenced to 10 years. Jonathan Reeves received 12 years. James Fletcher got 20 years and lost his law license. The offshore accounts they had used to hide their payments were seized and distributed to their victims. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Vanessa's divorce attorney contacted Helena to discuss my financial situation. Apparently, Vanessa had been expecting to receive half of my hidden assets as part of the divorce settlement. When she learned that I truly had lost everything, and that I was now working as a senior partner in a legitimate business worth hundreds of millions of dollars, she tried to reconcile. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered to Helena's office, where I now worked as Executive Vice President of Legal Affairs. It was 3 pages long, filled with apologies and explanations and requests for a second chance. I read it once, then fed it into the shredder beside my desk. Some wounds heal, some betrayals can be forgiven, but some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. Helena knocked on my office door as I was finishing the last of the day's contracts. "How are you feeling about tomorrow?" she asked. Tomorrow was the reopening ceremony for Morrison Industries. With the conspiracy exposed and my innocence proven, the company's assets had been returned to me. More importantly, Helena had agreed to become my business partner, combining her real estate expertise with my construction knowledge to create something bigger than either of us could have built alone. "Nervous," I admitted. "It's been 2 years since I walked into that building as the owner." "You're not the same man who walked out," Helena observed. "Neither of us is the same person we were when this started." She was right. The Albert Morrison who had been arrested 2 years ago had been successful but naive, trusting but vulnerable. The man I had become understood that success meant nothing without the wisdom to protect it, that trust was a luxury that had to be earned, not given. The employees want to throw a welcome-back party, Helena continued. Margaret Chen has been organizing it. Apparently half the courthouse staff wants to attend. I smiled at that. Margaret had been instrumental in exposing the conspiracy, and Judge Morrison had personally commended her for her courage in helping us gather evidence. She had been promoted to chief clerk and was now engaged to marry one of the court reporters who had also helped us. "What about David?" Helena asked quietly. It was the question I had been dreading and expecting in equal measure. David had written to me from prison, asking for forgiveness, claiming he had been manipulated, insisting that he never meant for things to go as far as they did. I had not replied. "He's my brother," I said finally. "He'll always be my brother. But he made his choice when he decided that $2 million was worth more than 23 years of family." Helena nodded. She understood the weight of family betrayal better than most people. Her own children had distanced themselves from her during the trial, believing the lies that had been told about her. They had only reached out after her exoneration, and the relationship was still strained. "Sometimes," she said, "the family you choose is more loyal than the family you're born with." I thought about the team we had built together over the past 6 months, former employees of Morrison Industries who had believed in my innocence and waited for my return. New employees who joined us because they wanted to work for a company built on integrity rather than corruption. Margaret Chen, who had left the courthouse to become our Director of Legal Compliance. We had created something that was more than a business. We had created a family based on trust that had been tested and proven. The next morning, I stood in front of the Morrison Industries building, watching as workers installed the new sign, Morrison Blackwood Development. The morning sun reflected off the glass facade, making the building shine like a beacon. A small crowd had gathered for the ceremony, former employees, courthouse staff, reporters, and even some of the other victims of the conspiracy who had become friends over the past months of legal proceedings and recovery. Judge Morrison, who had taken a personal interest in our case, was there to cut the ribbon. "This building," she said as the cameras rolled, "represents more than the restoration of a business. It represents the triumph of truth over corruption, of justice over greed." As the ribbon fell away and the crowd applauded, I felt a sense of completion that I had never expected to experience again, not just because I had gotten my company back, but because I had proven that good people could fight back against a corrupt system and win. Helena and I walked into the building together, past the lobby where I had been arrested 2 years earlier, up the elevator to the executive floor where I had once sat powerless as my life crumbled around me. My new office was larger than my old one, with a view of the city that stretched to the horizon. On my desk was a framed copy of Judge Morrison's order dismissing Helena's charges, not because it represented victory, but because it represented the moment when truth finally overcame lies. There was also a letter from the FBI informing me that their investigation had uncovered 3 more similar conspiracies operating in other states. The model that had been used to destroy Helena and me was apparently being replicated across the country, targeting successful business owners who could be isolated and discredited. But now law enforcement knew what to look for. The pattern had been identified, the methods exposed. Other innocent people would be saved from the fate that had befallen us. That evening, Helena and I sat in my office after the last employee had gone home, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sun set over the city we now helped to build. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been working at the courthouse that night?" Helena asked. I considered the question. "I think you would have figured it out eventually. You're too smart to stay fooled forever." "Maybe, but it might have taken too long. I might have been convicted, spent years in prison, lost everything. And I might have spent the rest of my life as a janitor, bitter and broken, never knowing the truth about what happened to me." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, Two people who had found each other in the darkness and fought their way back to the light together. "Albert," Helena said finally, "I want to ask you something." "What's that?" "Are you happy?" The question surprised me. I thought about happiness, not the simple contentment I had felt before my arrest, but the deeper satisfaction that came from surviving the worst thing that could happen to you and emerging stronger. "Yes," I said, and meant it. "I'm happy." I was happy because I had learned that justice, while slow and sometimes imperfect, could still triumph over corruption. I was happy because I had discovered that losing everything material could lead to gaining something more valuable, the knowledge of who you really are when everything else is stripped away. Most of all, I was happy because I had proven that good people don't have to accept injustice quietly. Sometimes, when the system fails you, you have to fight back. Sometimes, when everyone tells you that you're powerless, you have to find your own power. Sometimes, when they try to destroy you, you have to rebuild yourself into something stronger than they ever imagined you could be. The janitor who had cleaned the floors of the courthouse was gone. In his place stood a man who understood that true strength came not from never falling, but from getting back up when everyone expected you to stay down. The weight of injustice had nearly crushed me, but in the end, it had only made me stronger.